This is the photograph Mrs. Wing Sing and Son, taken in Montreal from 1890 to 1895 by Madame Gagné. Looking at this photo, we are curious about the popularity of the portrait during this era. We are also interested in the subjects themselves. How did they have the means to have their photograph taken? What was life like for these Chinese immigrants in the late 19th century in Montreal? I'm currently standing in the EV building, a part of Concordia University today. However, from 1889 to 1892, a laundromat stood on this block called Wingwa Laundry, located at 1491 St. Catherine Street. Relatives of the Wing-Sings may have owned this laundry, as well as many which appeared around Montreal from 1889 to 1915. Across the street, where the Farm Free is today, is where the first Wing-Sing laundry appeared in 1893. If the Wing-Sings in the photograph were connected with this growing laundry business, it may explain how they had the means to have their portrait taken. The photo was printed using an albumin process, which was invented by F. Scott Archer in 1851. It revolutionized photography because it was the first method made for the production of multiple copies. By 1860, the albumin process was popularized by stereographs and carte de visite, also known as sixpenny photographs because of their inexpensive and collectible nature. Photography took a strong commercial direction as the demand for copies of portraits and landscapes colossally grew. This phenomenon was known as cartomania. A. Desire patented the carte de visite in 1854 to operate like a business card. It spread like wildfire to many classes of Europe and ultimately North America. The dry process made photography accessible to amateur photographers who identified the method's simplicity. Nevertheless, the carte de visite eventually lost interest in the 18th century because photography was presented everywhere with newspapers, magazines, and the box camera, which made pictures seem less special.
The photograph Mrs. Wing Sing and Son is a bit larger than the carte de visite standard, which was mounted on a card that was approximately 2.5 by 4 inches. Therefore, it is likely that the photo was in fact a cabinet card. Established in 1866 in England and in the United States. Interestingly enough, the famous Scottish-born Montreal photographer William Notman was the one who introduced the new cabinet-sized photo, measuring 4.5 by 6.5 inches, to North America. The advantage of the cabinet card was able to demonstrate more detail in the sitter's face. The photo involves 2 poses that were heavily explored in the carte de visite style, the seated pose and the mother and child pose. The background and subjects are both highly staged. The background is painted with a floral pattern, and the persons are dressed in traditional attire, also known as cheongsam. It is interesting that a woman photographer, Madame Gagné, photographed Mrs. Wing Sing and Son. The most popular portrait photographers at the time were men, most notably William Notman and James Inglis. Not much is known about Madame Gagné, except that she is apparently found a niche market amongst the Chinese community. Many amateurs recognize the cabinet card and the carte de visite as a successful enterprise, thus it is likely that Madame Gagné took up photography to obtain a reliable income.
It is important that Mrs. Wing Sing hopefully felt empowerment by having her photograph taken, since Chinese immigrant women in her time did not serve a powerful role. For instance, Canadian immigration policies prevented Chinese women from receiving language training, and they were thus unable to work in English or French. If Chinese women did work, they were forced into low-paid factory jobs. However, Chinese women were discouraged from working even in their home country. According to Sharon Lee, before the founding of the Republic of China in 1911, Chinese women were isolated from education, employment, and political participation. Mrs. Wing Sing was presumably further isolated since in Chinese culture, there was a sign of respectability and affluence if women did not present themselves in public.
Denise Helly, a researcher trained in anthropology and specifically interested in ethnic minorities, notes that if a woman wished to visit a friend, a car would drive the woman between houses, even if it were only a block away. However, it is likely that Mrs. Wing Sing rarely paid anyone visits since there were only 1,000 Chinese in Montreal in 1900, and almost no Chinese women. The first head tax imposed on Chinese immigrants in 1885 at a cost of $50, which finally led to the Exclusion Act in 1923, would keep Mrs. Wing Sing from having much company and female companionship until 1947. when the act was dropped. Therefore, it is extremely relevant that Mrs. Wing Sing was photographed with her son because he was the central focus of her daily life. It is also quite incredible that Mrs. Wing Sing was allowed to have her photo taken at all. Even more incredible is that an unknown photographer took another cabinet card portrait of Mrs. Wing Sing in about 1895. Barely any information is available about this photo, but it at least lets us know Mrs. Wing Sing had an interest in photography.
The hardship of Chinese immigration to Canada continues to be a pressing issue today. When the head tax was established in Canada in 1885, $23 million was paid in all by 81,000 Chinese immigrants, which today has an estimated worth at over $1 billion. Mrs. Wing Sing and her son were definitely affected by this head tax. In 2004, the UN encouraged the Canadian government to financially compensate the Chinese immigrants whose families paid this head tax many years ago. While Stephen Harper apologized for Canada's racist history in 2006, no compensation has been made as of yet.
The photograph Mrs. Wing Sing and Son portrays the popularity of the cabinet card as well as the emerging Chinese community in Montreal. Some questions remain unanswered, such as, who was Madame Gagné, and how did she gain trust within the Chinese community?